In the final two lessons, we're going to look at why some arguments are false, and we're going to do this by examining fallacies. So, really in this lesson what we're going to do is introduce the idea of a fallacy and why they're important to understand, to really highlight where somebody's argument has gone wrong. We're going to distinguish between what we call a logical fallacy or a formal fallacy and informal fallacies. And then we're going to look at a number of logical fallacies and explain how they work, give a couple of examples. The next lesson will be focusing entirely on informal fallacies, the ones that you probably are more familiar with. So put simply, a fallacy is some kind of reasoning in an argument, in argumentation, that's logically incorrect, getting something wrong. So if you commit a fallacy, what you are doing is impacting on the logical validity of an argument. Or if we are committing an informal fallacy, you will be impacting on the soundness of an argument, so whether or not an argument is logically sound. So these are the two kinds of fallacies. So logical or formal fallacies, as we have talked about already, these are fallacies which denote an error in the form of an argument. So an error in the structure of an argument. It's another way of describing what we call a non sequitur. And really, when we look at, we're going to look at formal fallacies for the rest of the lesson, but you'll notice that they relate to the structure of the argument, not necessarily whether or not the premises are true or false, but the way in which logically it is structured together. This is the difference between a logical fallacy and an informal fallacy. On the other hand, as we've just mentioned, informal fallacies are really a much broader class of fallacious argumentation. They don't necessarily impact the validity of an argument. You can have an informal fallacy with an argument that is perfectly valid, but they impact whether or not the argument is sound. So this means that they impact whether the premises or the set of premises are true or false. And as I've already mentioned, we're going to do these fallacies in the next lesson. So let's have a look at some common formal fallacies or some common logical fallacies. One of them is the appeal to probability. This is where a statement takes something for granted simply because it's probably true or probably false. Okay? So simply put, just because something is likely to be the case doesn't mean that it's true. So if we were to have an argument where you have if you were to have an argument where you have a premise, okay, and this premise is central to the argument, okay, and it assumes the argument is true, it assumes it is true, the premise is true, then this could be seen as committing an appeal to probability. So let's take an argument, for example, okay, all ducks are black. All ducks are black. Premise 1. All ducks are black. Premise 2. Barry is a duck. Conclusion. Barry is black. This argument could be seen to appeal to probability. Okay, because you could make the argument, obviously this would be false, because not all ducks are black, and ducks come in all different colours and shapes and sizes. Okay, but if you would say that it is probably the case that all ducks are black, therefore I'm going to assume it to be true, and I'm going to use that assumption to conclude the rest of my argument. Well, you would see already that is not only is that a fallacy in itself, because we're committing an appeal to probability, but what we're also doing is it is also false. It's also a false argument, because we know that not all ducks are black, or any duck is black. I don't think I've ever seen any duck that's black. So you can tell that this is how an appeal to probability, can become problematic. A second form of argument is the argument from fallacy. This is sometimes known as the fallacy, and the argument from fallacy specifies that just because an argument contains a fallacy, it doesn't mean we can assume the conclusion is false. So what we mean by this is, just because there's a fallacy within the premises, maybe even a fallacy of probability like we've just looked at, just because there's a fallacy within the premises, that doesn't mean that we can say, well, if there's a fallacy there, then the conclusion has to be false. just having one part of the argument that is fallacious doesn't mean that the whole argument is false. Let's take a look at an example. If P then Q is the premise, the first premise, P is a fallacious argument, therefore Q has to be false. You can see here that just because we can conclude that P may be fallacious, it may be an appeal to authority or it may be an appeal to probability, that doesn't mean that Q is necessarily false as well. Okay, this conclusion does not follow logically from the premises. Generally, what we are suggesting is that just because P is fallacious, that doesn't necessarily sufficiently give us enough evidence to conclude that Q is false. We can't just conclude that Q is false just based on the fact that P is fallacious. So therefore, we would argue that that is a fallacy in itself. It is a fallacy, or the fallacy argument from fallacy. A third example could be the masked man fallacy. Now this one's a little bit more complicated and it requires a little bit of background. So bear with me before we look at the argument itself. Okay. The masked man fallacy is when someone uses the illicit use of what we call Leibniz's law in an argument. Now, all Leibniz's law is really arguing is that if two things are the same, okay, if A and B are the same, then they have to have the same properties. So if A is equal to B, then A has to have the same properties as B. That's what Leibniz's law states. In more philosophical terms, the argument is that if A and B are the same, then they are discernible. They have the same properties. So that means in logic, if A has a certain property, but B does not have that property, then they both cannot be the same. Okay? And people use this kind of reasoning in an argument, but they sometimes get caught up on it and can lead to a fallacy. And it's called the masked man fallacy because the first real codification of this fallacy looks a little bit like this. So premise 1, I know who Bob is. It's just a simple premise. Premise 2, I don't know who the masked man is. And the conclusion is, therefore, Bob is not the masked man. This is a fallacy. Okay? It is easy to see that the premises can be true. Okay? We can give an example, a counterexample. We can understand why the premises can be true, that you know who Bob is, and you don't know who the masked man is, but you can still have the conclusion be false. Therefore, it is invalid. Therefore, it is a fallacy. Bob could just easily be the masked man, but you just don't know that. Okay, that is what we would call a counterexample. Okay, so a counterexample is where you have an argument like this, okay, where the premises are true, but the conclusion be false. Okay, and it's giving an example of why this argument is false. So the counterexample to this argument would be Bob could just easily be the masked man, but you just don't know. You just don't know that. We don't know that about Bob. Take the simple example. I know who X is. I do not know who Y is. Therefore, X is not Y. What we are doing is, if you can think about it, it's a little bit like what we just suggested with Leibniz's law. If A and B are the same, then they must have the same properties. Okay, the property that we're talking about in this example is whether or not I know who they are. I know who X is, but I don't know who Y is. Therefore, they have different properties. Therefore, in my head, I'm concluding that they are not the same, or that they cannot be the same, because that's what Leibniz's law is telling us. But this is fallacious. Okay, this is not true. And we've already given you a good example of why, because I could just as easily just not know that Y is X. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some more fun, informal fallacies. We're going to conclude by looking at things like the fallacies of tu quoque, arguments to emotion, arguments of composition, all of these different fallacies before we finish off the course.